And then I got a phone call that J.J. Abrams was interested in meeting with me about what was being pitched as a stupid plane crash show. And I was like, that doesn't sound stupid to me. So I prepared over the weekend, and then I met J.J. for the first time on a Monday afternoon. And 13 weeks after that first meeting, we delivered the 2-hour completed pilot of Lost. That is not the script, but we shot the whole thing. All we were able to do was basically talk about the pilot. And so JJ would say things like, oh, there's a polar bear and oh, they find a hatch. And I'd be like, oh, that's cool. And he's like, and they spend the whole season, they found a hatch in the ground. But they can't open it. They spend the whole season like trying to open this thing up because they don't have any tools or explosives and I was like, yeah, cool. And he's like, and then finally in the season finale, they open this thing up and I'm like, what's in there? And he's like, I don't know. You'll figure it out. And so for the first year in particular, it was come up with an interesting question and worry about the answer later.
We were very rigorous about how we constructed episodes, and we were very conscious of trying to make episodes entertaining. People have asked, wouldn't it have been better if Lost was on HBO? And I think our answer is always no. I mean, we actually built the episodes around the 6-act structure of television. We wrote the act breaks out on the board. We had columns, and we were always searching for what's the episode ending? What are the act breaks? What is the incredible teaser that starts the episode? Behind all the crazy stuff we were doing, there was sort of a rigorous application of structure to the making of these episodes. And we would not rest until we actually felt like we had act outs and episode outs that were really great. I think we devoted a lot of attention to that craft.
Then each year after we finish writing the show, we do we have like a writer's mini camp where sort of freed of the duties of that year's scripts, we sit down and spend like 3 weeks talking about what the architecture of the upcoming season is.
All we talked about were the series, the season-long arcs, the mysteries, what the character arcs would be, what was the nature of the island, when we were planning on making certain reveals.
We'll go back to work. We'll spend a couple of days going through the notes the writer's assistants took from that 1 month. There's Damon, myself, and we have 6 other writers who work on the show, and we sit in this big conference room which has got whiteboards on all the walls, and we'll kind of remember what we did, and then we'll literally start breaking the first episode based on that.
We said by episode 5 this is what we find out, by episode 9 this is here. That would sometimes slide up or move back, but more or less that was it. Still, on a episode by episode basis, the hardest part of the show was just sort of breaking the episode, coming up with a sort of a beginning, middle, and end, because the show when it was working was just about a single person. So the cool thing was the show, there was a different protagonist every week based on this larger plan of, okay, this week we kind of need them now kind of heading across the island to have this confrontation with the others. So should that be a Jack episode, or is there a way to make it a Charlie episode? Maybe it should be a Charlie episode, but how is the action emotionally focused on him? So figuring out that puzzle every week went all the way through the final season of the show. We could only really be 4 or 5 episodes ahead in terms of knowing who it was going to be focused on versus what was going to be happening in the episode. So it had to be incredibly room intensive. The challenge is, how do you make a series out of people crash on island? Because the minute that they get off the island, the series is over. The first thing that occurred to me when I heard this idea was, well, here's the reason you can't do that as a television series, which is they can't get off the island. And then, right on the heels of that, I said, but what if you could get off the island? What would that look like? Well, is there a way you can get off the island every week? What if you got off the island and you were just showing these people's lives before the crash? Then the audience wouldn't be like, I need them to get off this island, because every week you're actually spending 20 minutes of story time off the island. When I went in and met with JJ, I presented him with the flashback idea, which essentially presented the show with a nonlinear format, in addition to trying to couch the show as a mystery show. So as opposed to starting with the plane crash, start with the guy waking up in the middle of the jungle, so you feel like you've been dropped there with him, and if he's feeling disoriented, then you're feeling disoriented, so you are Jack.
The first thing that we would say is, okay, whose episode is this?
Right.
This is a
That's
Saeed
key.
episode. Okay, let's start with this flashback story. And those were always the easiest to break because they actually had beginning, middles, and ends.
Right.
You know, it's sort of like they ended up being serialized to some degree because you had to sort of understand, and they're told out of sequence. So this is before Jack was married, and this is after, and this is when Julie Bowen is still in the wheelchair, and you have to kind of orient yourself. But when you're first sort of diving in there and doing those character introductions or telling the story of how Hurley won the lottery, as Carlton always described them, these like little New Yorker short stories.
Right.
So we'd start there and we'd do that in 5 or 6 beats. And then you'd say like, okay, so now what's happening to Saeed on the island? The basic formula certainly of season 1 was they made a mistake in their past. The island is now giving them a shot at redemption. Will they make the same mistake or will they evolve? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so that sort of fastidious attention to how we were going to break story, that gave it its sort of episodic structure.
We had this idea already that we were going to start doing flash forwards, that we were going to jump forwards in time to what we called the middle of our lost story, which is that several of the people in 6 of the Oceanic 6 were going to get off the island, and then we'd see what their lives were like off the island, and we would dramatize it by these flash forwards. But we can't do that until they give us an end date. Well, the miracle occurred. They gave us the end date, and we pulled the trigger on that idea. We Trojan horsed our first flash forward in the season 3 finale. And we made it look like yet another, oh my God, Jack is drunk, he's got a beard, he's miserable, it's going to be the same, another one of these. And it turned out to be our first flash forward, which was an enormously exciting storytelling mechanism, because the show, an episode of Lost, is a balance between island storytelling and off-island storytelling.
We were always searching for this idea of like, how do we make the flashback and the present day story have resonance, thematic resonance? So if Sawyer is going to go off and kill a boar on the island, then how does that relate to a flashback story about his, hunt for the person who's responsible for his parents' death?
First of all, I just think that collaboration is the best part of television, and that it is a collaborative artistic medium, and I think people who are successful in television are good collaborators, and I believe that if you collaborate well, you get something that's better than the sum of the parts. I feel like as a writer, I work better when I can bounce ideas. I like doing that as opposed to sitting alone staring at a blinking cursor. So for me, the creative process gets activated when I have someone to bounce ideas off of. We would sit around a table, and there are big whiteboards there, and we would talk about the show in great detail and put the beats of the story up. Beat by beat, act by act. We use the sort of commercial breaks structure of network television as an organizing tool. And, every writer who comes to work on the show has a point of view and brings something to the table. And the best thing that they can do is argue for their point of view. And, our role is really to serve, as guides and referees to those discussions. So
The writer's room itself is the jury room. And every single person in that room is going to take turns being Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men, where you're juror number 8, and you're the one person who has to convince everybody else in the room to do it this way. And the minute that you reach consensus, that's when you can then take the idea out into the outside world and field test it. It wasn't like, we would walk in and say, allow me to present the case for why Sun and Jin must die. And then someone goes, no, you can't kill them. It's like, we basically come in and we've got the case. We know we're going to do this. We've been talking about this for a while. And it's like everybody wants to arrive at a guilty verdict, but everyone kind of has to be convinced in their own way. So, and then in some cases, you can be doing that for 3 days, and then someone will say, but what if we don't kill them? Let's talk about what the implications of that would be. And you've just illustrated the lesson that I have to learn over and over and over and over and over again, which is when you can't reach consensus, neither idea is the right idea. You have to mutually reach the third idea. Right. And that's why I think so many movies and TV shows are kind of can end up being shitty, which is, it does become about a gavel bang in terms of the decision-making process, as opposed to the much more time-consuming process, which is collaboration is very time-consuming.
It's exhausting.
It's why the divorce rate is so high.
Yeah.
There all these reasons, because it's exhausting. but ultimately it's highly rewarding, and ultimately passion wins, which is like, if you're really passionate about an idea and you think it's great, you'll do almost everything to sort of convince the room of your brilliance, because you know it in your heart. But if you can't convince them that it's brilliant, then it's going to die on the vine, and it's an excruciatingly terrifying process.
Litmus test.
It's not for everyone, and it's very humbling. Because you want to come into these things thinking, I'm gonna take a risk. Here's an idea that I'm really passionate about, and I know that it's great, but I don't know how to convince everybody that it's great. And there's a lot of fear attached to that.
You can see the influence of certain writers on the show. And for instance, Eddie Kitsis is a guy who was very obsessed with these sort of minor characters who he kind of gave life to and imagined. So like Frank Lapidus or Frogurt were so much the product of Eddie. And the greatest thing for Eddie was Frogurt getting shot with a flaming arrow. That made him feel, But at the same time, that he and his partner Adam Horowitz, they also they were sort of the soul of Hurley, and so they wrote a lot of the great episodes with that character. And I think in hindsight, looking back, I think we would say we could never have done that alone.
Part of being on a staff is not just being a good writer. Part of it is being like a person that somebody wants to sit around with for 12 hours a day. And I think sometimes writers kind of don't think about that part of the job as much when they're interviewing for the job. It's like, if showrunner's interviewing you, they're thinking about, okay, is this person a good writer? Do they have good ideas for the show? But more importantly, am I really going to want to be seeing his face, for the 56th hour this week? And so I think you really, that, and it's definitely harder when you come into a show, because there's kind of, I think, some hazing that inevitably goes on when you're the new kid on the block. And I think if you're kind of very, you have to walk that fine line between being sort of very resilient and accepting of that, but also not be a complete pussy, and that's... I've had writers that have come on to staff, and when they start getting, teased or abused, get kind of hostile, and then people are like, we don't like them. But then you also don't want to just completely roll over. So you have to find that very careful line.
If you have a writers group and you guys basically say, we are going to convene on this date, and a week before this date, we are going to exchange material so that on this date we can actually be in a position to notes each other, then that's a real deadline versus one that you just set for yourself.
You need to finish what you started.
Why?
Because a leader can't lead until he knows where he's going.
Whatever you're working on, it's impossible for you not to use your writing as therapy, and to deny yourself that instinct is to hamper your writing. And at the end of the day, sometimes you don't realize it as it's happening, but in hindsight, you're able to look at it and go, "Oh yeah, okay, so that's what was going on here." And I think essentially, when Lost happened, my father died like a year and a half before that, and so obviously, at the time that I was writing, I wasn't and doing anything more than writing, but very quickly it became apparent to me, it's like, okay, so the lead character of the show is completely and totally overwhelmed. He does not want to be a leader. He became my guy. And then, but slowly but surely, the other thing that started happening was I was having a kind of a spiritual awakening as a result of my father dying, because my dad was sort of a self-professed atheist, and when an atheist dies, it's very hard because you're not allowed to say they're in a better place now, even if that's what you believe. And so I was starting to have all these sort of theological things emerging, and then Locke became sort of the guy who was this idea of something suddenly he was up and out of the wheelchair and he wanted to ascribe some meaning to it. So instead of saying the word God, he would just say the word the island. So if you look at the first season, my own sort of, kind of spiritual search, if Locke is saying this means something, or the island wants me to do something, but I don't know what it is, became sort of interchangeable with that. And then those became the two poles of the show that I was so interested in, that culminated in that season 1 finale, when they're actually having this kind of, man of science, man of faith debate. And so that's whatever's going on in your own head or your own heart, if you can put it on the page, it will feel, even in the context of a genre show or a Crazy Island show, there will be some kind of truth to that struggle. So it'll be hard for me to think of anything that's as personal to me as this show.
That's amazing.
I do feel like one of the things that we always wanted to do and we're very passionate about doing was exploring the idea of purgatory, both figuratively and literally. And purgatory is about judgment. And this show has never really offered up what I would call Christian Judeo judgment in terms of there's a deity. It's always about self-judgment. So the idea of like, you know, does Jack think that he's worthy? Or can Sawyer forgive himself for his sins? Or did Kate kill her stepfather justifiably? So I always felt like if the characters can forgive themselves, then they can, then the show's over. The show's called Lost. It's not because they're on an island, it's because they're lost. So,
right.
So how are we going to creatively demonstrate that? Self-forgiveness, we're gonna do this idea.
We didn't call it the sideways in the writer's room. We referred to it as the bardo, which is, for those of you who've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's essentially a concept where when you die, you don't know you're dead. It's sort of like Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense. And your journey is about coming to the revelation that you have died. And once you come to the revelation that you have died, then you are ready to move on. Every episode of Lost started with the question of what's it about? And as opposed to answering like, well, this is the one where a boar, you know, comes and trashes Sawyer's tent and he's got to go chase after it, and then he and Kate play I Never. No. What's it about? Like, what's this episode about? And it's like, oh, this episode is about Sawyer starting to let go of his thirst for vengeance for the man he believes responsible for what happened to his parents. That's what it's about. And then thematically for him, and then there's another level below that, which is it's just basically about forgiving people. That's what this one's about.
There really was this voice that you cannot hear, and that voice that you cannot hear but is still talking to you is the show or the story that you're telling. If you could not hear that inexplicable voice of the show telling you what it wanted to be, then it wasn't going to work for you on Lost. And nobody could really sort of describe, this is what we need to do, or we need to do a reveal here, or this episode needs to have a twist in it, or it's time to kill another character. It was just sort of like, you know, when Locke and Boone first found the hatch and they're basically looking down at it, we had talked about the idea of the hatch and that they would find a hatch, but then we settled on this idea that Locke was going to find it, and then we were like, oh, he should find it with Boone. And then, oh, wouldn't that be a great Abraham and Isaac story? And Boone's going to die. Like, and I feel like the show just told us that. Like, we just threw out there, Locke should find the hatch and with Boone. And then suddenly this idea just sort of manifested itself. And that idea, when people, you know, there's nothing more frustrating for a writer to answer the question, where do you get your ideas from? Because the answer is so mundane and we don't really know the answer. Sometimes it's like, oh, I was watching this thing on TV, or this happened to me in my real life and it's based on that. But most of the time it comes from that the story ether that might carry unwritten world of, you know, of the grid that interconnects, you know, all these cultures that tell the same stories without having any access to one another. So Lost was really just an exercise in listening to the show, and when we couldn't hear it, we had to you know, just push forward to the best of our ability. The story and the plot is really just a you know, delivery system to create empathy and connection, to care about characters. And if the characters are just sitting around doing nothing interesting, you're not going to care about them. But if you can put them into intense circumstances, the audience is more likely to care for them. But that's, you know, the Trojan horse of the show was the mysteries, but what we really cared about, and I think what a large portion of the audience really cared about, not to say that they didn't care about the mysteries, were the characters.
To boil it down to its simplest form, it's what's your secret, you know? So that idea of like, if you fundamentally accept the rule that every single person in this room has a secret, and it doesn't mean that you haven't shared it with some people, but, you know, and if you look at your characters and you apply the same logic and say, they have a secret, what is it? And it might not even come out in the process of, they might not tell it, they might not reveal it, it might not be germane to whatever your story is, but if you commit to it and decide what it is, that automatically gives them a level that they did not have previously. For Lost, it just so happened to be essential in the building of that show, but I always feel like that's an interesting place to start. We were more inclined in the research department to actually go to other movies and TV shows and books, like especially when we got into doing time travel. The conversations that we had about time travel in general and how time travel worked and how we wanted to do time travel on the show were the most pervasive and ongoing conversations that we had. And the language that we used was, you know, what are we doing, Back to the Future time travel or Peggy Sue time travel? You know, it's like, well, Peggy Sue time travel is like, you know, maybe it never happened, but well, let's say it didn't. Let's say it's non-paradoxical time travel. So you actually start pulling from all the sort of shared references that you have and saying, let's do it like that because they've done it before and you can learn from it.
So at the end of the show, the last frame of the show, Matthew Fox closes his eye and dies.
Yeah.
That happened, like in our context of happening, like that happened. That's all real. Then, from the moment that he closed his eye, all that other stuff that we did in the sixth season of the show, the flash sideways, where nobody knows each other and the plane never crashed, that is whatever your interpretation is. I'm not going to talk about what our intention is, but that's what you would define as not having happened or happening. But everything that we ever showed you, anything that takes place on the island in Lost, happened.
We had been lobbying for an ending of the show almost from its inception, you know, very early on for the reasons that I talked about before, that we knew we were going to run out of certain levels of storytelling. But more importantly, it's a mystery-based show, and so if you have a mystery-based show and it's an episode of Law and Order, the mystery is resolved by the end of that episode and it feels self-contained and you move on. But for Lost, it was serialized, so we knew that these mysteries needed to have solutions. So we actively started lobbying for an end date of the show. That right at the same time that we got our end date, within the space of about 3 weeks, The Sopranos ended, and we were almost unanimous in our love for The Sopranos ending. We just kind of thought it was perfect, and without even realizing why it was perfect, it just was. And that was terrifying too, because it was like, how are we ever going to step to that? In the wake of The Sopranos ending, we started hearing all this negativity surrounding The Sopranos ending from the fan base, which was like, it's a cop-out, what does it mean, did Tony get shot, etc. It's like, you asking those questions defeats the entire purpose of the way that David Chase chose to end it. We started kind of arguing with Sopranos fans, and in the space of that argument, we came to the secondary revelation, which was, there was no ending that we could possibly come up with that was not going to be highly divisive. And once we embraced that idea, we were no longer afraid.
Because ultimately, we all love the excitement and titillation of a mystery, of not knowing what's going on. And ultimately, I think that the big thing that we all fixate on is what's the resolution of that mystery. So if someone gets murdered in an episode of Law and Order, like by the end of that episode of Law and Order, it's sort of resolved. You kind of know who did it. But if you apply the same the same logic to a season of The Killing, where someone is murdered in the first episode and the resolution doesn't come until the finale, or if I'm talking about The Killing, even into the second season, then you're into the more relevant part of the equation, which is the one that I'm struggling with, which is delayed gratification. Just how long is too long? And I think that the basic equation is the longer you wait to resolve a mystery, the better the resolution has to be.
I get inspired by stories that don't do the math for me. Those are the kind of stories that I like to tell, stories that leave a lot to the imagination so that when they're over, you can kind of fill in the gaps yourself. I am really driven by the untold story in the context of much larger mythology.